Alright, so this one is going to be about retcons, basically, to sum up. Retcons and certain decisions you might make a lot of the time in service of saving a campaign. So this is kind of a sequel to that video I did like 2 weeks ago, avoiding the death of a campaign. This is going to be related. So, first, subject of retcons. What do they mean? How do they work? What is a retcon? And there's a few different ways, there's a few different kinds of them, pretty much. Like, there's the softer retcons, where it kind of goes along the idea of, like, if you haven't said it yet in the story, but it's in your head, it didn't actually happen yet. It's not completely nailed down as to what it is. Like, say you have this particular event. Ooh, that guy's coming in hot. You have a particular event in your character's backstory that is important, but you don't have, or you have a version of it in your mind. And then something happened, and your character hasn't talked about it yet. It hasn't actually come up in game. So, as the game goes on, until it comes up, you're free to change it however you want. Or if something particular happens in the story, and as a result, you get a really cool idea to how to change it. You change it. So that's kind of like a soft retcon. It's barely even a retcon because it hasn't been discussed yet, and so it hasn't been canonized yet. It hasn't happened in the context of the story. And then another version of this is, details that you leave blank in your backstory so that you can come up with them later, or the DM can fill them in, or whatever it is. And then you've got other things, like, say, you've moved past that where you've talked about that event in your backstory. And then something happens and you get this idea, like this inspiration hits you that, oh man, this would have been really cool if this was part of this, if X was part of the event that happened in my backstory. Well, if it doesn't contradict anything, go ahead and add it in. But then if it does contradict, you might have to talk to the DM about it and go over it. Is it worth breaking a little continuity to add this really cool thing? And sometimes it is. Or, the idea of, say, like a quick retcon. You guys are at a general store buying supplies. The party is buying supplies for when they set out of town next. Like, that's what they're doing next. And then you get kind of like out of town and you start walking, and then one of the players is like, oh, I forgot to buy this at the general store. Like, I wanted to buy this. It's like, okay, yeah, just mark it down. Instead of the DM going, nope, you didn't say it. It's because you can't remember everything, and as long as it's something your character would reasonably remember to do, you can retcon that kind of stuff. Or say, two other characters are doing really important story beat stuff, and it's not as appropriate for you to just interject with something relatively minor you're doing. So after they conclude their whole thing, you might interject, oh, while they were doing that, my character was doing this. Which is fine. That's great. That's an easy way to modify the story sometimes and make sure your character does the thing that you want them or need them to do. And so this is going to get into... Now I'm going to get into less about retcons themselves and, like, story, like, left turns and big, like, sweeping changes you might make to save a campaign. So, like I talked about in the last video about this, our Curse of Strahd game is on hiatus and we need new players or we need to be rolled into a different group. And regardless of how this is going to happen, 3 characters need to, quote, disappear. And if it's one character dropping out at a time, you can usually kind of go, okay, they're just there, and then, you guys camp out overnight. When you wake up, they're gone. Something like that you can usually do. Okay, this is a tricky intersection. And that's usually a decent way to, like, get rid of a single character. But in our case, we have 3 characters to get rid of. I'm waiting. Okay, I can go without dying. That's the goal. Don't die. So, we have 3 characters to get rid of. How is that going to happen? Well, fortunately, we just had an event happen in the story that this very powerful figure can call in a favor for us at some point. So, I figure this powerful figure can show up and whisk those 3 characters away, and then we never see him again. That's kind of how it is. And also, on the off chance one of those players might come back somehow, their schedule dramatically changes and they can come back, you can kind of weave that back in. Otherwise, maybe the opposite, especially if we get rolled into the other campaign. The opposite happens. This powerful entity whisks the 2 actual players away and shoves them into the other game. Something along those lines. But, like, those are some dramatic choices you can make to kind of preserve the narrative. Usually they're a little thin, they're not great, but they do the job. But how do you identify what those might be, and how do you do that, and when do you do it? Well, usually when you need to get rid of characters or add characters, you just have to come up with some kind of reason that a character can just show the fuck up, or they disappear. Like, it can be a little awkward sometimes, but you just kind of have to push through it, and once the character joins the campaign, it's good enough. Like, in the Erlmeyer campaign, this happened twice. First, we had the character Niana, a Sea Elf wizard, join the party, or join one of the parties after they had split. And the way it was set up was the characters are in a tavern, pretty much, or right outside a tavern. They're in town. And then this cloaked figure just approaches them and starts asking them weird questions, partially because the player didn't fully understand the narrative of what was going on. But they just start asking questions, and appropriately, the existing players are a little apprehensive about this. Or, not the players, the characters are apprehensive about this. And it's kind of slow going and touch and go, and they kind of get into an argument, and they're not, like, playing too nice, because everybody's playing to their character, and why would we just let you, what are you doing here? Who are you? And then, like, a little fight happens, and they kind of join up that way, and it's okay. And then, later on, that character gets kicked out of the campaign. And because this wizard has time magic, chronomancy wizard, not a chronergy, not the wild mount subclass. This is like a homebrew subclass that's relatively similar. But so this, they have some time magic, so that's a little thread you can pull to have this character disappear. So what happens? The parties join back up, and it's like the next day they rested, and this time wizard had just used this really complicated spell to, like, view the future. It's really weird. It's one of the goofiest homebrew spells I've ever seen. It's super complicated. It's apparently based on a spell from an older edition, but it's still incredibly complicated, and it doesn't really need to be. But not the point. And it doesn't go too well for her, because she fails some saves and gets some like weird Crimson King corruption and red lightning and all this shit. Bleeds from her eyes, all good stuff. And then that's kind of it from there. They sort of succeed at what they're doing, but the town gets destroyed, and then they join back up. And the next day, the character wakes up, the player is gone at this point, they've been kicked out. So the character just starts having a weird time corruption fit and disappears, skipping down the time stream. Because this was also another narrative idea we had, that this player was going to have or they had already had a pretty spotty schedule as to whether or not they can make it. So we were going to have this idea that this time wizard skips down the time stream, and whenever the player can't make it, the character isn't there, and they are moving forward in time to the next time that the player can make it, more or less. And this is a very easy solution to them dipping in and out, as opposed to just having the character run in the background half the time. So then we adapted it into a reason the player is gone, or the character is gone. Then another player joined, or like at the same time this was happening, another player joined. And they had joined with a drow druid. And they were in town investigating something, I forget what. It was tangentially related to the Crimson King, because it always is. They were investigating something, they found our group, they just approached us and were like, oh yeah, you can join, but you're weird. You know, the players know that this character, or this is another player character, so just let them join. And then they kind of meshed in and it worked out. And then the player very suddenly dropped for life reasons. So then, in the middle of an ongoing, like they dropped out in the middle of a confrontation, more or less, like this big tense thing that could have boiled over into actual war, like an ambassador's meeting. And so then this druid, because now they're expendable, we have to get rid of the character. It's either they would have teleported back to the Feywild where they're from, or they die. And we ended up going the route they die. They came out and they just suddenly emerged out from like behind some barrels or out of the ocean, out of the bay that we were at. And a group of crossbowmen, which were already in a very tense situation, just opened fire on her and she died. Then they were reprimanded and stuff, and that got rid of the character, and it was alright. But, you know, wasn't great, but it's a way to get rid of the character. And sometimes you just have to do that kind of thing. So, going back to Curse of Strahd, or that Curse of Strahd game, it's going to be something like that. Something relatively quick to just get everything back in. Especially if, like, say 2 or 3 more players join. We got to get those old 3 characters out and get the new characters in. Or maybe those new players play the old characters for a short stretch of time. But that's just the link. Those characters have to be pulled out somehow. And that could be tricky. Maybe maybe they get pulled out. Or sometimes what you can do is a kind of rewind. Like, rewind back to the previous, like, long rest. Maybe everything that happened was a dream. But you still have the stuff that you acquired during that day, so maybe not. And all those characters are gone. There's a lot. You can ass pull a lot of stuff here. You just have to come up with something that's like logical enough. Dream sequences, time rewinds, resets, all those types of things work out. Or even because we're or if we were going to roll into the other game, this is two separate instances of Curse of Strahd. It's two different games. And we've made different choices along the way. So the world, the environment, the characters, they've gone through different events. So if we were to just join the other game wholesale, what happens? A lot of our choices kind of disappear. Or you roll the two instances together, and now both choices have effectively happened, and it's very strange. Like, an important NPC in our instance was killed, whereas in the other instance, they're still alive. So how do you rectify that? I guess both happened. They're alive and dead, and there's two versions of them, maybe. Maybe there's, multiversal variants or timeline splits. There's a lot of shit you could get into here. But yeah, I guess this one's just a follow-up and some more rambling on that kind of idea. Retcons and how to kind of save a campaign and some of the leaps of logic you might have to do. But, that's it.